to thank the entire Gippsland Region Library Network for bringing this together, because it was a real team effort. And one thing that's great about these online talks is that we can have authors who are very far away from us. Like you said, Barry's in Perth. Welcome, Barry, to tonight's talk.
Thank you, Claire. How does my hair look from Perth?
Your hair looks amazing. Now, Barry's having a dig at me because I made a slightly derogatory comment about his bald head, which I'm truly apologetic. So we're going to just skip over that, and we're going to go straight.
It's easy to skip over, yeah.
We're going to go straight to talking about your book, which Vicky said is your first novel. By no means your first book, but your first novel. Now, I imagine that the people in the audience tuning in tonight probably haven't read it yet, and maybe they're tuning in to hopefully be inspired to read it and get it from the local library or buy it from the local bookstore. So without giving too many spoilers away, I just wanted to give a little bit of an idea of what the book is about. Driving Stevie Fracasso is the story of two brothers who've not seen each other for 30 years, and they're thrown together on a road trip across the United States of America in the weeks leading up to the attack on the Twin Towers in New York on September 11th. Now, I've heard you talk in other interviews about how in lots of ways this book is kind of like a love letter to New York from you. It's a city that you visited very regularly. But what I wanted to know more about is your own connection to this particular event, such an iconic event, and why you decided to feature it as the backdrop to the action in this book.
What a great first question, Claire Halliday. Excellent. Yes, I do, as you alluded, I do travel to New York. I've been every year, apart from last year and this year, obviously, since 1991. So I go there every year, and I'm a journalist. So I write lots of travel stories, music. I'm a music journalist as well. I write music stories. I write about gentrification. I write about neighborhoods, all sorts of things to do with New York. It's I like to say that New York is not just my favorite city, it's one of my favorite things. I just love it so much. And it never, I feel like I can't exhaust it going there. It just seems like this place that constantly reinvents itself, even though it's got so much there that's been there for years and years and years and years. But getting to the heart of your question, I do go every year. So in 2001, I did my usual trip, and I normally go in September. Of course, it's autumn in New York, and as the song says, autumn in New York, that's the time to be there. It really is beautiful that time of year. So I booked my trip as I normally did, and I got a call a few days before I was due to go from my best friend saying, well, I guess you're not going to New York this year then. I said, why? And he said, aren't you watching TV? I said, no, I have a job. And he said, turn it on. And I said, what channel? And he said, any channel. And of course, I turned it on and I saw what was happening. It was September 11th. And I was due to go 9 days later and land 10 days later. So I didn't cancel it. I thought, what safer time is there to fly into New York than 10 days after 9/11? Security is going to be so tight. So I did go, and I'm so glad I did, Claire, because New Yorkers gathered in their hundreds at Union Square on 14th Street, and I happened to be staying just near there on 17th Street. And every afternoon, every evening, just hundreds and hundreds of them would gather, and I go there every late afternoon, sort of twilight. And it was just incredible because people, well, some people were having arguments, some people saying we should bomb the hell out of the Middle East, basically. And other people are linking arms and singing Give Peace a Chance. There's students walking around trying to get names peace marches. There's cops there that are really strong police presence. There's Buddhists chanting with incense. There's kids writing these heartbreaking messages on big sheets of butcher's paper with candles everywhere, with melted wax. It was such a visceral scene, I guess, because it seemed that New Yorkers obviously have a reputation of being tough as nails and being rude, not having time for anyone. But that trip particularly, I just saw that the shell of New Yorkers had been dented and it had softened them a little bit. And everyone wanted to talk. Everyone wanted to give an opinion, but also everyone, I think, just wanted to sort out in their heads what's happened, what's going to happen, and what's going to happen to our city after this. And I think now it's interesting that my book's coming out now in 2021, because now New York's going through another reckoning with COVID, because it's one of the most affected cities in the world, I think. And everything that makes New York, New York is kind of gone right now. Everything that I go to New York for, you know, the bars, the cafes, the stores, the people, the neighborhoods, the life of the place is not there because of COVID. And for a time there in 2001, I think people were thinking the same thing. Can this city ever recover from what's happened down there at the World Trade Center? But of course, it not only recovered, it thrived. Downtown New York just completely started booming after that. And I think it just shows the resilience of the city. And it's weird how I get kind of emotional about it, because I'm not from New York. I've never lived in New York, but because I go there every year and I've gathered so much from those years, it's sort of amassed with me. And I just feel like a lot of people feel, it's not a unique story to me by any means. People feel like it's their city and they've got their New York story. And I write a bit about that in the book, how everyone feels that their New York story is the New York story and it's unique to them, even though it might jibe with exactly what 1,000 other people have when they go to New York. But for me, you're right, it is a bit of a love letter to New York. I dedicate the book to New York. I thank my wife and children in the acknowledgements, but I wanted to dedicate the book to New York especially. Sorry, Claire, I've lost you. I can't hear you.
I think you're on mute, Claire.
I can hear you, Vicky. I can't hear Claire.
Okay. Sorry.
There you go.
No, there you are.
Yeah, sorry. I must have been under a blanket mute, but I'm back now. No, I was just going to say that I heard that you came up with the idea for the book 10 years ago. Now, I'm not saying, you know, you're a slacker or anything, but what have you been doing for that 10 years? Is it that it took so long to write a novel because you are a working writer with a job? Or, you know, was it a 10-year process of writing the book paragraph by paragraph, or was it just a lot of thinking and planning? Because I'm sure there might be some, you know, wannabe writers perhaps listening tonight.
No, your first assumption is correct. I'm a total slacker. I just sleep most of the day and do nothing. Next question. No. Yes, I did have the idea 10 years ago, and I started writing it 10 years ago. And but yes, I'm a working journalist, and I've got 2 kids, and life kind of gets in the way. And I wrote other things as well. I write short stories. A short story collection came out in 2010, actually, when I got the idea for this book, 1970 something. As Vicky said in her intro, it was a book that came out then, and I promoted that for a while. I also write non-fiction. I brought out a non-fiction book in 2015 about the Maiden Guitar Company in Melbourne and its history and the effect it's had on music. And I wrote about 1,000 stories and 30,000 record reviews and all that kind of thing. But in my spare time, I like putting air quotes around that, I would come back to this novel and just do bits and pieces on it and try and put it together and apply for grants that I never, ever, ever get. And then the story of how this ended up getting this final push to finish the book and actually show it to someone is a lot due to Trent Dalton, weirdly enough, who I don't even have to say who Trent Dalton is in this venue, I'm sure, because everyone has probably bought Voiceover's Universe and is probably reading All Our Shimmering Skies now. There you go. But for the 1 or 2 people who might not know, he wrote Voiceover's Universe in 2018. which is, I think, the fastest selling Australian novel of all time. I think it sold 500,000 copies or something. Anyway, in early 2019, I got assigned to interview Trent for the Sunday Times magazine here in Perth. And I interviewed Trent, and anyone who has interviewed... Have you interviewed Trent, Claire?
No, I haven't, but I love his writing.
Yeah. And his writing is like him. He is the most enthusiastic, driven, electric guy. And talking to him just gave me a kick in the ass. Can I say kick in the ass?
You've already said it, so yes.
Can I say it again? Kick in the ass.
Yeah.
Yes. He did. And just, he wrote that book between the hours of 8 p.m. and 10 p.m. every night after doing a full day as a journalist like myself at the Australian magazine. He's got 2 daughters like myself, so he's got family responsibilities. He's got a wife who he occasionally has to talk to, like I do with my wife. We've got all the same pressures, and yet he, 2 hours a night, managed to write this wonderful book. And I got off the phone from him and thought, pull your finger out, Divola, and get this done. But more importantly, in that story, I had to do secondary interviews, which for people that don't know, a secondary interview is if this is a 4,000 word feature I had to write. And you have to interview other people, not just Trent. You've got to write people he knows or other writers, and his publisher, who is Catherine Milne at HarperCollins. So I interviewed her and had a great interview with her. And at the end, she said, so Barry, have you got a novel in you? And I said, actually, Catherine, I've got one about halfway out of me, but I am still sort of toying with it. And she said, well, if you finish it, send it to me. I can't promise anything, but I promise I'll have a look at least. So that gave me the impetus I needed between Trent and Catherine. And by Christmas that year, Christmas Eve actually, I pressed send on it, sent it to Catherine. I went to Sydney in January of 2020 to visit family, just pre-COVID. Had lunch with Catherine. I got to tell you about the lunch.
Okay, tell me, because we've got to fit in a lot more questions.
Okay. I thought it was going to be a lovely literary lunch. She called me up the day before, said, I'm really busy. Can we just have coffee and sandwiches in the lobby of HarperCollins? And I thought, this is like a bad date. I've been downgraded from a literary lunch to sandwiches and coffee in a coffee cart. She's going to give me the bad news. She's dropped me. But no, she said, I love it. I want to acquire it. And that's how I ended up with HarperCollins, all because of that interview with Trent Dalton forcing me to get this book out of me.
Well, connections are a powerful thing, and you know, motivation and inspiration can be found in so many places. Hopefully people listening to you are maybe inspired to get cracking on something they've wanted to start. But I wanted to dig more into the book now. As we said at the start, you know, you are a working writer and you've written a lot of non-fiction and short fiction too, but you are a debut novelist with this book. And they say that, you know, people who write their first novel are always writing themselves in some part. So you've obviously been a music reviewer and a writer, and on almost every page of Driving Stevie Fracasso, there's a reference to the music that the main character, Rick McLennan, who is also a music writer, is both loving and hating. So I'm wondering how much of the feelings Rick expresses about his personal music opinions are actually really similar to your own.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I'll go back to my wife here, because after she read the book, she said to me, well, the book's not about you at all, but everything about it is so you. And I think that's exactly right, because a lot of the stuff about the book, New York, the road trip, music, all that stuff is my world and what I live in, even though the characters are just completely fictional and really not like me in their characters. But yes, with Rick's music opinions, and not just Rick, also the older music journalist, Elliot Postman, who's kind of like Rick's Obi-Wan Kenobi or his Yoda. A lot of what he says is stuff I believe as well. These little pet theories I have, such as, I hate people who say no good music has been made after 1969. I stopped listening to music in 1969 or 1979 or 1983 or whatever it is. It's because you stopped caring about music then. It's not that no good music has been made after that time. It's just that you were probably 23 years old in 1969, and that's when music means so much to everyone because it's your life, you know. So that little theory I gave to Elliot, and that kind of is one of my theories too. So yes, a lot of, especially the pet hates that some of the one of my pet hates, Claire, is, as you say, I'm a working journalist, and music journalism is how I started, and I still write a lot of music journalism, even though I write other stuff too. But every time I read a bio or a press release that talks about our music is really honest, or I think the songs on this album are just the most honest I've ever written. It's like, I really don't care. If it sounds good and it's really dishonest, if the music's great, I don't care if it's dishonest. You could be, was David Bowie being honest when he wrote about a starman in the sky? You know, he probably didn't see a starman in the sky, but that's one of my favorite songs. So yeah, that little opinion about writing honest and about honesty in music, it's like, that was one of my little pet hates as well. And I gave that one to Rick. So yeah, there are a lot of little niggly things in there that I liked getting out because they were my little pet hates as well.
Now, in the novel, Rick is 40 years old, but I guess in many ways it kind of feels a bit like a coming of age story because he is discovering himself. So I was wondering, without too many spoilers for people who haven't read it, what can you tell us about the lessons Rick needs to learn about himself and the world around him and the journey that he has to go on in driving Stevie Fracasso?
Yeah, it's really interesting about the whole 40 thing and coming of age because I recently heard an interview with Meg Mason, who wrote Sorrow and Bliss, as some here have probably read, and her main character's 40, and it's kind of she almost has a coming of age moment at the age of 40. And Jacqueline Maley's new book as well, The Truth About Her, is a journalist who is turning 40, and her life completely takes this whole other turn as well. So I think there's something in the air at the moment with protagonists who are 40 and are only suddenly having a reckoning about their life as if they're 18. And there is an extended adolescence. A lot of people into responsibilities, perhaps, that are coaching in this extended teenage period. And Rick definitely that kind of character. This isn't a spoiler because it happens very early. He loses his job, he loses his girlfriend, and he loses his apartment in New York, all within the space of 24 hours. So he's basically brought down to earth with a crash very early in the story. And a lot of the book is about how's he going to cope with that? Is he going to cope with that? And can he possibly rebuild his life at all? And one of the big holes in his life is the fact that he hasn't spoken to his brother Stevie in almost 30 years. And it's this central relationship to his life that was severed when he was a kid. And it's the missing piece, really. And so when these two are thrown together in a stolen Nissan Stanza, driving from Austin, Texas to New York, the trip, in a way, is the journey that they're taking. It's a physical journey they're taking, but it's also a journey that Rick's got to take to figure out, how am I going to piece this fractured family life that I've had? How do I figure out how it's affected me? And plus another bomb gets thrown into his life, which would be a spoiler to say, with his girlfriend. So a lot's happening to Rick. I liked throwing things at him and putting obstacles in his way and making his life hell to see how he might get out of it.
And of course, when you describe the story in that, a greater detail for the people listening, I guess the backdrop of the 911 setting makes a lot more sense too, that, everyone is having their own sort of self-reckoning in a way, like you said. You've written the book in a very filmic way, I think. You've got an accompanying soundtrack. There's a real sense of kind of movement on the pages. The journey the characters are going on is obviously a physical movement, But there's a lot of, growing up and emotional movement too within everything that's happening. I was wondering if you could tell me about the part of you that might have been writing your novel in the hope that maybe it might also be picked up as a potential film or TV script.
A huge part of me, Claire. And anyone out there got any connect? Anyone know Reese Witherspoon out there? I'd love it if Reese took it up. You don't. You surprised me. I thought you knew everyone, Claire. You don't know Reese. Oh, well.
No, sorry.
You're dead to me. No use. But
So
yeah, you're absolutely.
Yeah.
You're absolutely right. I did think Netflix series or film. Happy with either of those outcomes. I cast it in my head as well. Do you want to hear who I've cast in my head?
Well, that was going to be my next question now that you've said that. So yes, tell us.
Okay. Now for Stevie. So Stevie Fracasso's, he's about 40. He's about 48 in the book, and he's a washed-up rock star basically who pretty much blew his mind, drugs and mental health issues. Like 30 years ago. So I'm looking for someone who could possibly play that. Now, this guy who I've got in mind will have to bulk up a little bit, but I think he can pull it off, and that's John Cusack. And the fact that John Cusack starred in High Fidelity, I think there's a nice connection there because I was a huge fan of that book. Obviously, they even say on the back of my book for fans of Nick Hornby. So, yes, I'm definitely thinking John Cusack could do Stevie. For Rick, I've got Paul Rudd. I think Paul Rudd can play every man really well. Once again, we'd have to rough him up a little bit, but, Paul Rudd's, I read the other day Paul Rudd's like 50-something. He doesn't look 50-something, but I think he could still play 40 quite easily. For Jane, that is Rick's ex-girlfriend. I'm thinking Linda Cardellini, who was in Dead to Me, the Netflix series, and way back when she was in Freaks and Geeks. I mainly wanted to cast her because I have a crush on her and have done for years. And in my head, that's who I was writing Jane as. And then who else is there? Oh, the Uber fan, the sort of Uber fan that lives in his mother's garage. Nelson, his name is. I want I'm going to get his name right. Zach Galifianakis from the Hangover movies. Always pictured him when I was writing this guy that lives in the garage and is obsessed with Stevie Fracasso and doesn't want Rick to write the book because he thinks he's an imposter. And finally, Elliot Postman, who's the Obi-Wan Kenobi music journalist, who I said before. I don't want an actor for that one. I want the director, Jim Jarmusch, who is about 6'3", shock of white hair, always wears a black suit, always smoking a cigarette. Looks like I've interviewed him actually, he is one of the coolest dudes on the planet. And that's who I want to play Elliot Postman. So that's my cast, Claire. Get Reese on the line and we'll get it made.
It sounds like it's all planned out, but I'm wondering if you've sort of foreseen any sort of Alfred Hitchcock-esque cameo where you wander across the scene doing something bizarre.
Goes without saying that I'll get a walk on. Goes without saying.
Now, getting back to the story of the book and not just your dreams of, being on the big screen, the small screen, one thing that I think your book taps into really brilliantly is the connection between music and significant memories and the way we hold on to those memories and, that we hear a song and we're transported back to those moments in time. So I'm wondering, you've been a music writer, that's been your living. What's your very first memory of the music that really grabbed you?
Oh, wow. I remember the first single I bought is really kind of uncool, but kind of cool in a way. I don't know if you remember a song called Popcorn. It was like an instrumental song that went. Yes,
I do.
Yeah, that was my very first single. So how cool is that? Not very cool. See, I think people curate their first memories of music and the first records they buy. Nick Hornby has actually written about this, and it's true. I think you sort of go, oh no, it was the Beatles. Tomorrow Never Knows. That's not true. Everyone buys a commercial song they heard on the radio when they were 11 years old. So but I was a radio kid because I was sort of a kid in the sort of early 70s. So little transistor radio, a National Panasonic transistor radio. I listened to the top 40 all the time, and I was obsessed with it. So I gave that to Rick, that whole collecting the top 40s and seeing what goes up, what comes down, what's a bullet performer, all that stuff. That's me. That's totally me. So yeah, I was a music kid. And then to get back to your question about what really blew me for six, I'm in a band here in Perth called Radio Radio, which is named after an Elvis Costello song. I play a Fender Jazzmaster. I don't know if you can see it, the electric guitar there, which Elvis Costello is pictured playing on the cover of his debut album. We play four Elvis Costello songs, which gets me to the point that Elvis Costello completely blew my little shiny head in 1978. And after I heard those first two albums, I just got into all that punk, new wave, post-punk stuff. So, you know, XTC, The Clash, The Jam, The Pretenders, Squeeze, all of that. And Australian bands too like that, like Sports and the Sunny Boys and all that kind of thing. So that's really my era that I love. And they're the songs I play in my band now as well here in Perth. So that's the music that really had an effect on me.
Now, we are talking a lot about pop and rock music, and obviously there's a lot of references to that in Driving Stevie Fracasso, because the character who the book's named for is a sort of washed up rock star, like you said. But it's your love of jazz that intrigues me, because I think that seeps into the book in a lot of different ways. So what is it about jazz that you love? And is that something that you've grown into with age, or have you always had that passion?
That is a great question, because it's weird with jazz, because I'm by no means a jazz aficionado at all. But I can't, even though I listen to music a lot, obviously, being a music writer as well and being in bands as well, I can't write while I'm listening to music with lyrics. I just can't do it. It's just too distracting. So I listen to a lot of jazz. When I was writing this book, I listened to a lot of jazz because it's all instrumental and it just washes over you. And because I'm not super au fait with jazz, I've got favourite artists, but it doesn't distract me, but it's great background noise for me to listen to. But as I was listening to more and more, and artists that I gravitated towards were like Miles Davis, John Coltrane, Sonny Rollins, in breaks, I would start reading up about them. And I read about Sonny Rollins, that when he was living in New York, the guy living above him, his wife had just had a baby, so he thought, I can't disturb him by practicing my sax all the time because he's got a kid that's waking up 5 times a night and whatever. So Sonny Rollins used to go out to the middle of the Williamsburg Bridge in downtown Manhattan and play sax for hours standing on the bridge. And I thought, that is such an amazing story. And that ended up, as you know, making it into the book. I gave one of the characters that, and she ended up doing the same thing, emulating Sonny Rollins. Similarly with John Coltrane, I had a song by John Coltrane being played by a jazz trio in Washington Square Park in a really key flashback scene for Rick and Stevie, the brothers. And that's totally because I was listening to that song over and over. It's called Central Park West. So it was in Washington Square Park, as I say in the book, wrong park, right song, because it just soundtracked that whole scene for me. And I listened to it over and over as I was listening to that, writing out that scene. So yeah, that's the way jazz ended up making its way into the book, totally just through what I was listening to at the time. And that happened with other music too, not just jazz. There's chapters in there that, unless you're a fan of this band, The Replacements, who are a great band from the 1980s, there are 2 chapters in there that are named after replacement songs. So yeah, there are certain artists that to me really encapsulated what I was trying to get with these characters. And sometimes I just listen to those songs to get into the headspace of both Stevie and Rick. And The Replacements was one of those, the Velvet Underground, the Modern Lovers. With Wilco, for a lot of the New York stuff, Wilco, Nada Surf, these bands that just, to me, are really evocative of the big city, and certain albums, certain songs that I really associate with New York.
Now, for the people tuning in tonight who maybe all these musical references you're mentioning going over their head,
Sorry.
get it? No, that's fine. But, you know, music fans, like you said, of particular music are going to love this book for many, many reasons, because there are so many little references that only fans of certain types of bands and music would get. But it's more than just, you know, dropping in musical references. It's a book about relationships. It's a book about family. So what else can you tell us about the book for the people who music isn't the thing that will make them choose this?
Yeah, I mean, the music thing is a good hook to get people interested in the book, but it is by no means just, as you say, a book about music. And the reviews that I've been reading that I've been loving have actually said that. They've said, if you love rock music and if you love US road trips and if you love New York City, you will love this book. But there's this whole other human story. My best friend, Frank, who lives in Sydney, who I went on a road trip in 1994 across the US, and some of the things we saw are actually in the book. He actually rang me after he finished the book and said, I was a bit worried because I thought it might just be a geeky music book, and I thought, is it going to appeal to people that aren't in that world? And he actually, and this is big because he's a pretty tough dude, he said, by the end, I actually was crying. And I went, great, I wanted to make you cry, because he was one of the people I really wanted to get across to. And the human element of the story is people close to you dying, people in your family that you're not close to anymore, relationships that you've stuffed up that you really shouldn't have because you've really hurt someone. So these are all elements that I wanted to put into the human story of these characters. A lot of it's to do, as I said before, with the sibling relationship. And part of that was because I'd interviewed two artists in Rolling Stone, actually, two music artists for completely separate stories who had mental health problems, but are pretty well-known artists. And in the course of reporting those stories, I also talked to their younger brothers who are also musicians, and talking to them gave me this extra, I guess, dimension to how these brothers could relate to each other or try to relate to each other. Because the younger brothers in these real-life situations pretty much saved their bigger brothers and brought them through madness, literally. And both those bigger brothers ended up having revivals in their careers because of these younger brothers. One was Rocky Erickson from the 13th Floor Elevators, who died a couple of years ago. And the other one's Jeremy Oxley from the Sunny Boys. And it was both their younger brothers who gave me sort of that extra dimension for these characters. It's not the story of either of those sets of brothers, but it just gave that little extra element to help with the story. So, yeah, I mean, there were bits where I teared up when I was writing it, especially the scene where the brothers find their father, who has dementia. And a lot of that came from my mother didn't have dementia, but she did die last year in the middle of the year, and I was stuck here in Perth and couldn't talk to her. So all of that stuff with Stevie playing Autumn Leaves on the guitar and singing for his father, that's totally from me singing to my mother over Skype, because I couldn't be there and she couldn't communicate with me. And so I totally gave that I completely rewrote that scene. Originally there was a physical fight and he was fine, just an angry old man. And I completely changed that scene after that, and that came from my own experience, because I felt I really wanted to put that into the book and give that to Stevie.
I wanted to ask you about, you know, the logistical effort of writing fiction as opposed to writing non-fiction, which has obviously been your career for so long, and how different or how much more challenging or better it was for you to write fiction than non-fiction. Was writing fiction something you'd always wanted to do, and did it come easily for you with this book?
Yes, it's definitely something I always wanted to do. And as I said, I've written a lot of short fiction. But writing a novel, A, it's time consuming, right? And B, it's hard to get a whole picture of a story over 95,000 words and sustain it for that length. There's a lot going on in a novel. There's subplots, there's characters, there's timelines, there's flashbacks, there's all sorts of stuff you've got to do. And if you're time poor, you can't just sit down and do it in 6 weeks and go, great, got my first draft out at least. So it was difficult in that respect. But getting back to the whole non-fiction fiction thing, there was a lot of stuff I could use from my career as a journalist. As you would know, Claire, in journalism, if a person reads the first sentence of a story in a magazine or on a website and they go, yeah, you're gone. They won't read the rest of the story. They won't even read the rest of the paragraph. So openings, not just to the book, but to each chapter, that really helped me to get the hook in straight away. Conversely, endings, not just of the book, but of chapters. I mean, in stories, we call them kickers, right? The end of a story, a magazine story or a newspaper story is the kicker. And learning how to do it right, a good kicker is a real skill that you build up over time. And that really helped with me writing my chapter endings and the ending of the book as well. So I found I could use some of my skills from being a journalist and transfer those to being a fiction writer, and that helped. The problem, I guess, is that with writing non-fiction, almost having the constraints of writing facts and knowing that you've got to get a certain story across in a certain space, and that space is maybe 1,500 words. There's something nice about that constraint. To think, I can do that, and I can do that by next Thursday, which is my deadline. Whereas with a novel, before you actually show it to someone and get a book deal, you're just writing it for yourself. You don't have a deadline, and you're not exactly sure where it's going. And almost that freedom freezes you, because it's a freedom that can be a bit of a constraint in a weird sort of way. You know what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely. Now's the time for me to give the audience a prompt, because, it'd be lovely if people that are tuned in tonight maybe had their own question that they could pose to you. So now's the time to make sure, if you are listening tonight, to type the question into the chat, because Vicky from the library will be coming to those questions if you do send them. Otherwise, Barry and I, as you can probably gather, can definitely keep talking. But I wanted to ask you about the other side of that while we're hopefully waiting for some people to have some questions. Not just the process of how different writing fiction is as opposed to non-fiction. I'm interested in the emotional difference, because, what we've touched on so far is, we've joked about it, these little elements of you that have popped up in the characters of your novel, and, the dementia, your mother's dementia, different familial relationships and how you're sort of drawing on them. How hard is it when you are writing elements of yourself, but also bearing your soul as a fiction writer, as in, this is my creation, I'm showing it to the world, this is what I've come up with. How much harder is that compared to non-fiction?
Yeah, it is more difficult. I think people, though, assume, Claire, that it is all about you. Like I've had some people even say to me, well, actually, one of the biggest compliments I was paid was, when did you live in New York? What years did you live in New York? And so I've never lived in New York. I took that as a huge compliment. But and other people were saying, I didn't know you had a bigger brother. Like, I don't have a bigger brother. So I think a lot of people assume, I think it's generally with novelists, they assume that you're writing just slightly shaded versions of yourself, and that's really not the case. But as I've said, there are certain things that I have given to different characters, and certain situations that I've been through that I've tried to give to the characters. But I really didn't want to do just a story about a guy who lives in Perth that's a music writer and has 2 kids. That'd be such a boring book, because my life's not boring. God bless them. My kids are on the other side of that closed door. Hopefully they're okay. And it's not, my life is not as interesting as I hope Stevie and Rick's life is and their story is, because fortunately my life's fairly happy, and I come from a happy family. I had no trauma in my childhood to draw So in order to write this novel, I had to make these characters up, but put them in a world I know, give them some traits that I have, but otherwise just fictionalize everything and try to make it believable. And so I love it when people do think that it's real, because hopefully that means I have kind of done my job correctly as a novelist.
Well, it could be seen as a bit insulting. I guess there is that trope that, like I touched on, that people assume that novelists are just writing themselves, but it's sort of saying, don't you have an imagination? But of course, writers do have an imagination, but it's obvious that we're drawing on elements of our lives.
I think it's, science fiction writers and fantasy writers, or, people writing about 2043 or whatever. They don't get asked that, even though they often use elements from real life in it. But I guess if you are writing a book set in the real world that's either 20 years ago or contemporary, people are obviously going to think, well, he's obviously just writing about himself. And Rick is a music journalist. I mean, I can't complain when people do think, oh, Rick's obviously you. But no, a lot of stuff that happens to Rick has got nothing to do with me at all. But yeah.
Vicky, are there any questions from the audience, or we can keep chatting? Maybe you've got a question too, Vicky.
There's a question here from Deb. I'll just read what she's written. I haven't read your book yet, Barry, but it sounds great and it's definitely on my to-read list. As the story she thinks is based on a journey, I wonder if you wrote the narrative in a linear way, or did you jump back and forth writing different scenes? And I might tack my question onto that. It's going back to you saying about it being very filmic, I wonder if you saw this, if you visualized the scenes as you were writing them? That's how you write?
Yeah. To the first question, no, I didn't write it in a linear way. A couple of things stayed the same throughout the book. At the beginning of the book, I did write at the start, and it hardly changed at all. I tweaked a word here and there, but the opening of the book was always going to be how it opened, which is almost like a little prologue about where Stevie and Rick are on 9/11. But then I just went all over the place. And every time I just think, oh, I really need to write about that, I'd write it down and just do that, put it in a file, and there was just no sense to it. Anyone who would have opened the Driving Stevie Fracasso file on my computer would have just thought, what the hell is this? It's just all over the place. It doesn't make any sense. I'm in 1972 here, I'm in 2001 here, I'm in 1994 there. And I knew where the story began and I knew where the story ended. And then I had this road trip and I thought, what cities do I want it to appear in? Where do I want the car to go, the stolen Nissan Stanza? And I chose those cities as markers along the way. And I thought, okay, New Orleans is in the first quarter of the book, so here's what happens in New Orleans. Then they go up to Clarksdale, Mississippi, they go to Memphis, they go to Nashville, they go to Knoxville, they go to Philadelphia. And I thought, I want different beats of the story to happen in these different cities. And I'd visited all those cities, so I knew what the cities were like, and I knew the atmosphere of them, I knew the kind of people that were there and the places they would go to. So that helped a lot as sort of novelists often talk about a roadmap that they follow when they're writing a book. And I had this physical roadmap. I've taken it down now, but I had a map on my wall that I mapped out the route, and I would always look at it to see where I was on the trip every time I sat down to write. So, answer to that person's question, no, it wasn't linear, but then I had to figure out how it would make a proper story, and I had to pull it all together. And your question, Vicky, about did I visualize it when I was writing it? Yes, definitely. Getting back to what Claire was saying, have I thought about a film or a TV series? Yeah, because I visualized this in my head so much. And as you now know, I was thinking of Paul Rudd driving down to pick up his brother, John Cusack. I definitely had visualized it. And more importantly, the places they were. If they were in a bar, I knew in my head the type of bar it was because I've been in a lot of bars in the US. And I knew if they were in a dive bar in Memphis, what that dive bar would be like, what would be on the jukebox, what the bartender would be like, who'd be sitting at the bar, because I'd been to those places. And I was always visualizing it. And yes, getting once again to Claire before, I even had the soundtrack in my head of what song might be playing at that time. So there's a scene in a bar in Memphis that involves the song Every Rose Has Its Thorn, which is a shocking song. I hate that song so much. But I really wanted it to soundtrack this scene where Rick gets a particularly hard time and walks out of the bar with something he didn't expect, which I won't give away, but is an important part of the end of the book.
Now, Vicky, I've seen a couple of extra questions float past, but I've also seen some nice comments which Barry might have missed, and I was wondering if you could maybe read out a couple of those as well, which, you know, writers need a boost.
So the last comment that's come up from Susan saying she's not a non-fiction reader, but Barry has sold her on reading the book, so that's fantastic. And not a question, but wanted to say that it's a great chat between Barry and Claire, lovely online format, and Emma's listening in her PJs, getting children ready for bed and cooking her dinner, and looking forward to reading the book too. And Deb has also said she agrees and is looking forward to reading the book. And Deb actually tacked on her first question, which you got to in your chat, was about the soundtrack, movie soundtrack, and which bands, which I think has been covered. But there is another question down here from Emma. Did you find it hard to let the characters go after you finished writing? You said you'd been writing it for 10 years, and she imagines that they've lived in your head for so long. So how do you let them go?
Oh, that's a really good question. Yes, I did. And once again, without giving too much away, the ending, I had an ending, and then I decided to add an addendum, I guess, to the ending, because I wanted to think about the characters in the future, not too far in the future, just a little bit in the future and what might happen to them. And the way I did it was I put 3 fake Wikipedia entries in the book for 3 different characters. And one character I just loved was Jane, the girlfriend, because she was so hard done by because Rick was such an idiot. And I wanted her to have a good ending. And I think I did it in pretty much the last line of the book. And I didn't want to tie everything up in a bow for Rick, so I didn't give him a perfect ending, but I think it was an ending that maybe he didn't expect. But I think he realizes that he's found happiness in a way he didn't expect he would when he was being a pain in the ass. There you go. I said ass again.
There'll have to be a wear warning or something on tonight's talk. Vicky.
Yeah. Oh, I'm sorry. Getting back to that question too about the soundtrack that someone said, I've actually got the Spotify playlist that HarperCollins have put up. And since, Vicky, you said this is going to be up for people can stream it later, yes? I might send you the link to that Spotify playlist and you can put it in your show notes or whatever you like. So people can actually listen to, it's got pretty much every song that's mentioned in the book and also songs that inspired the book that I was saying to Claire before I was playing when I was writing it. So it goes for almost 2 hours. And some people have told me they've actually used it on real road trips they've been doing while they've been traveling, which is great. They've sent me photos of them in the car with a copy of my book and it playing on their car, which is great.
It's a little niche market somebody needs to develop.
Yeah.
I have another question, if you don't mind. Are these American characters? And if so, what did you have to do to write authentic dialogue? I know you say you've been there, but is there sort of a checking process with the publisher to make sure you're not going to upset the legion of American readers? Is it published in the US? Can you explain a little bit about that?
I want it to be published in the US. I'm hoping that a US publisher, I mean, of any book I've ever written, this is the biggest chance I've got of being published in the US, because as you say, it's a US story. The characters are American. It's all set in the US. Although Rick does spend part of his childhood in Australia. From the age of 11 to his 20s, he goes back to Australia with his mother. But yes, they're American characters. So yes, hopefully, if anyone there has got a connection with US publishers, please shout it from the rooftops. So basically, I'm just sourcing stuff here for people to just help my book get out there. So as far as writing American characters, I mean, I just read so many American novels and watch so much American TV that I kind of think American anyway. And I did want it to be an American story because I wanted those elements of New York. I wanted a US road trip. I wanted all that American music that I love in there. And so I always knew it was going to be a US story. And I didn't do the whole writing in dialect, like there's characters that are in Mississippi, which is in the deep South, in New Orleans. And I think there's a danger when you write characters that everything's, yo, how you doing? You know, and it just never rings true. So I tried to write the dialogue so it wasn't too full on like that, but you got the idea that this person was from the South or was from Nashville or whatever. But it wasn't that much different to writing the characters if they were Australian. It just, there wasn't Australian slang or anything in there. So yeah, that wasn't too difficult to do that.
Now, Vicky, are there any more questions? Because I have one last question to finish off with if there's nothing.
Just a big yes to the soundtrack from Deb. That would be great.
Yeah, I love that idea. The soundtrack thing is a really interesting thing. I know I read a story about Christos Tsoulakis when he wrote The Slap and it was being made into the series on, I think it was the ABC. He provided all the actors with a soundtrack of what he thought each individual character would listen to.
Yeah.
And it was for the actors to immerse themselves in the characters that he'd created. So music can be used in so many powerful ways to really connect people with memories and time and place, and it's a really interesting device. But Barry,
yes.
Something that you just said there made me think of my last question, I think a fitting last question. You know, we are talking to an Australian audience tonight, but as you said, you have written a book set in the US with US characters. But I'm intrigued by Rick, the character, who does go and spend that chunk of time in Australia, a sizable chunk of time. In your opinion, did that Australianness that he experienced in his life make him somehow other in the US setting? Did it change him?
I think the main way it changed him, Claire, was that it separated him from Stevie, not just emotionally, but physically on the other side of the world, and they completely fell out of touch. And also, he has a terrible relationship with his mother, who is a bit of, and once again, my mother, nothing like my mother at all, but I needed to, once again, throw things at Rick, and having a relationship with his mother that just was pretty toxic, I thought was a good thing to throw in there. So the main reason I sent him to Australia was to increase that distance physically as well. And then he always dreams New York, he always dreams of going back to New York, but he doesn't get back there. But Stevie moves there after Rick moves to Australia. So he gets to live Rick's dream. And he feels resentment about that Stevie got to do what he wanted to do. And Rick got dragged off to the colonies. So there's also that's between them as well. But once again, there's a lot of spoilers I can't say, but there's a lot of little things that Rick doesn't know about his past. He's being told a story about his past that isn't actually true. And he slowly discovers this in the journey, as you know, along the trip. And these little bombs start going off in him along the way as he discovers these things. And part of it's got to do with him being dragged to Australia when he was 12 years old, along with a few other things as well, a few other surprises. But you've got to read the book to find out.
That is a perfect way to end because we don't want to give any spoilers. And it's a perfect way to point people back to the lovely library folk from the entire Gippsland region of Library Network, who I'm sure have your book. Thank you, Barry Divola, for spending an evening with us all the way from Perth, because it's afternoon for you. I guess the sun hasn't even set. And thanks to everybody who has taken time out of their night to join us tonight.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Claire.
Thank you, Claire, and thank
Barry.
you, everyone, for
Thank
joining
you.
us too.
We'll be sending out that link to the recording and the soundtrack if you could provide that to us. And just keep an eye on all of the library's Facebook pages and websites for upcoming events, including some with Claire. And thank you very much, both of you, for your time. And we look forward to reading the book.
Thanks, Vicky. Thank you very much. Thank you, Claire. Hope to talk to you again soon.